Afternoon, and a very warm welcome to the Institute for Advanced Study. This is the sixth event of a lecture series, Scholarly Correspondences among Orientalists during the early and late modern period as a historical source. One aspect that is important to us to look at is the other possibilities digital scholarship tools can open up to explore the material at hand. And this is why the series is co-hosted by Near Eastern Studies and Digital Scholarship here at the IAS. And with this, I pass the word to my colleague, Maria Mercedes Tuya from our IT department, who is in charge of digital scholarship here at the IAS.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. We're really glad that you could join us. Let me just add some housekeeping rules at this point. We would kindly ask that you keep your microphones muted so that we don't interrupt or distract our speaker today. We will be using the chat for questions and comments. Please feel free to add them during the talk or at the end. Sabine then will read them and Paul will answer them.
And now I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Paul Babinski, who joins us today from Copenhagen. Paul Babinski is a historian of philology and literature whose work explores the scholarly culture of Oriental studies in German lands and throughout Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, with a focus on early modern Islamic manuscript collections and their Orientalist readers. At present, he is a postdoctoral researcher at the ERC Synergy Project, the European Quran, Islamic Scripture in European Culture and Religion, 1150 to 1850, at the University of Copenhagen. Prior to joining this project, Paul received his PhD here at Princeton with a dissertation entitled World Literature in Practice, the Orientalist's manuscript between the Ottoman Empire and Germany, a study in which he reconstructs the emergence of early modern Oriental studies as an encounter with a living Ottoman intellectual tradition. And today, Paul will present some of his findings of his current research, a comprehensive study of how early modern Orientalists read the Quran. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sabina, and thank you, Mercedes, and thank you, everyone, for coming. Can you hear me all right? Great. So the subject of my talk, the 17th century French librarian Louis Picques, published almost nothing during his lifetime. Just a single short pamphlet on Descartes. But he's a prime example of how much scholarship happens off the printed page. Picques made his mark within networks and institutions, as a correspondent within a transnational community of scholars, as the head librarian of a major library, and as a mediator between scholars and institutions. So as such, I see him as something enigmatic. He's a kind of transitional figure. He stood at the culmination of a particularly capacious tradition of Oriental studies in the 17th century, one that by the 1680s and 90s was bursting at the seams with new material coming in from places like Istanbul and Egypt. But a tradition that hadn't yet fractured into the subdisciplines that we know today. He's also a kind of pioneer of scholarly communication, a doctor of the Sorbonne who took up a rather unprecedented and a very extensive correspondence with Protestant German scholars in the mid-1680s and into the 90s, when Protestant France was being dismantled by the state. So the revocation of the Edict of Nantes to 1685. And it's really just at this moment that he starts doing the scholarship by which he's known today. Finally, and this is a bit more speculative, I see Picques as at a turning point in Oriental studies toward what one might call more bibliographic concepts of scholarly novelty, in which scholars worked within big cataloged collections in order to reverse engineer research questions from unstudied material. So I think the basis of this are the expanding manuscript collections that we see in places like in the 17th century, in places like Paris and Leiden and Oxford. But it's also rooted in foundational works of bibliography, and I'll talk about one in particular a bit later. So who is Louis Picques? So what we know of Picques in his manuscripts As with many subjects related to 17th century French Oriental studies, it built on the work of Francis Richard, who's written several essays about Picques in an enormous amount of detail and found a great number of sources on it. Picques came from a devout family. He was the son of a merchant. He's one of 7 siblings. And he studied at the Jesuit Collège de Clermont. Now it's the Lycée Louis le Grand. After which he, like his 2 brothers, Bernard and Pierre, studied at the Sorbonne. And after a trip to Rome in 1669, his only published work appeared. A very short work on Descartes that has no connection, at least that I know of, though I haven't been able to track it down, with his later Orientalist scholarship. And then was named in 1688 as the head of the Bibliothèque Mazarine, the library of the Collège des Quatre Nations. So Picque's scholarly activity was concentrated in the last 2 decades of his life, or appears to be, at least from the sources. And it's very hard to date Annotations, so it's very hard to say this with absolute certainty. But my sense from the sources that Francis Richard found, but also what I've been finding in Copenhagen and Paris and other places, is that there was a kind of multilingual turn in his studies, specifically around 1683. And I don't have a clear explanation for why this is, though I have a few guesses. And later in the decade, he then becomes the librarian at the Bibliothèque Mazarine. He completes an inventory of the libraries in a small task, and then he retires around 1695. And it's really after his retirement that we see the bulk of his letters. So for the most part, very few of these letters were known, I think, until quite recently. His library was bequeathed after his death to the Jacobin monastery in Paris. This was dispersed during the French Revolution. This is where we get the word Jacobin, because that's where they met. And now that correspondence it's not clear what happened. But that correspondence is in a number of different places. So the letters that he sent, we find, for instance, the letters he sent to Job Ludolf in Frankfurt, they're still in Frankfurt today. They were partially edited in the 18th century. And a portion of his correspondence, the letters he sent to Montfaucon and Mabillon, were edited in the late 19th century by a scholar here in Copenhagen. And there also is a group of letters that were sent to Gabriel Grodek, who we'll talk about a bit later, that are now in Berlin in his Nachlass, as well as a number of annotated books. However, the largest number of the letters, and really the vast majority of the letters that were sent to Picques, are actually also in Copenhagen. And the Gigas, who edited the late 19th century edition of Mabillon, Bale, and other letters here in Copenhagen, appears to have basically just ignored these letters. It's also often unclear that he wrote them. And some of them were identified here in Copenhagen as being connected with him, but many of them weren't. And so what I did is I just basically worked through the entire of the core letter collection, what's called the Bølingskib-Samling here in Copenhagen. And based on a number of signs, sort of created a kind of a list, collection of the ones that I think with very high probability were Picques. In total, there are about 122 letters. There's a number of kind of borderline ones, so I'm not entirely sure. But what's also interesting is they appear to have come from along with his papers. And some of that material is now cataloged with the Oriental manuscripts and under other codes and call numbers in the Royal Library in Copenhagen. The largest number of these letters were sent to German scholars, and above all to two in particular, Gabriel Grodek and was a Hebraist, and Job Ludolf. In particular, it shows, I think, a quite distinct network. That's also evident when you look, for instance, at Grodek's letters that took shape in the 1680s and 90s that connect German, French, Danish, British, and Italian scholars. So most of the time, in many cases, I was able to identify the letters on the basis of Picque's annotations, and it gives here a sense of how he read, but also I think why he wrote. Picque pretty consistently writes when he receives and responded to letters, sometimes adding other relevant information. Regularly extracts often names of individuals or works onto the margins of the page, and employs a number of techniques like underlining and enumerating in order to clearly mark out information to make it easier to access that knowledge later. So to understand the moment that these letters illuminate, or that I think they illuminate, I think it's helpful to situate them within two developments in the longue durée of Oriental studies. One is, I think, as a kind of meshing or melding of what we would later consider as two very distinct forms of scholarly inquiry, which are what one might call polyglot biblical philology and Islamic studies. And they have two very distinct histories in some ways in the 17th century, but you often find scholars, and here Picque is no exception, who are operating within both of them in sometimes different ways and sometimes the same ways. So when I say polyglot biblical philology, I really mean in particular the editing of biblical texts associated with the polyglot Bibles and polyglot dictionaries, so like Schindler, but in Castell in particular. Editions of the Gospels, such as Wheelock's Persian Gospels, but also Marshall and Unius's Gothic Gospels, which, if you look at the notes, is full of Arabic and Coptic, includes a lot of Arabic and Coptic. And in general, sort of projects of studying and editing languages, particularly in non-Semitic languages or more obscure languages that were at the time relatively unstudied. Coptic is here of great importance, so Kircher, but around the time that Picque was working, Thomas Marshall was trying, I think he dies in 85, but he was trying to edit the Coptic Gospels. And I think in particular of considerable importance were Ethiopic texts, and so texts in Guz and Amharic. And here in particular, Hiob Ludolf played a particularly prominent role. And I think in part it was Ludolf's reputation among French scholars that connected Picque to him, and then through him to all of these other German scholars. And then also Mandaic, Amharic, a language that, or Aramaic language that I'll talk a bit about later, that Picque was kind of a pioneering figure in studying. And then, so that's one tradition. The second tradition is what I'm kind of calling Islamic studies. So it's not a word that anybody would have used in the 17th century, but referring specifically to the combined study of Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. This begins, I think, in particular with Raimondi around the turn of the 17th century. And then in the 1630, late 30s and 40s, it really takes off through the work of a Leiden Orientalist by the name of Jakob Golius. And its crowning achievements really are the compilation of the major dictionaries of Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, all compiled by Golius, compiles dictionaries in all the languages using a variety of sources in Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. So that's really the task, is you have to use all of these Islamic philological sources, but it requires you to learn 3 languages, often which you study with a group of people or, in order to compile these dictionaries, which in turn are often collaborative work. And Meninsky's 1680 Turkish Dictionary, I think, also fits into this. As well as the studies, what we see starting particularly in the 1630s and 40s, which is the study of commentaries, of literary commentaries, first on Persian literature and Arabic literature, but also of Quranic commentaries. And this corresponds with state-sponsored collecting in the Eastern Mediterranean, I think, in both cases. So I think that both of these are kind of happening around the same time, but there's a lot of overlap between them. A good example would be Wheelock's Persian Gospels are full of his Quranic studies. And I think it's a moment where that kind of disciplinary differentiation simply doesn't exist. The second sort of longue durée story that I think that Picque is part of is the relationship with the connection between French and German Orientalists in particular, which is an important 19th century story, in particular because of the central role played in docessi and training Orientalists and German Orientalists. But in the 17th century, you actually see before Picques very little connection whatsoever between French and German Orientalists. There are some exceptions. So Rabius is in Paris, he's giving away manuscripts. But for the most part, what we see in the 17th century is something of a feeder system of young German scholars who are coming to, in particular, to Leiden. Some of them end up in England as well. But Warner, Gentius, Raue, Hottinger, Deusing, Elichmann, they all go through Leiden. Raue a little less, and in particular because of the central role played by Jakob Golius. What happens, I think, around the mid-century with what I was referring to as polyglot biblical philology is that the sort of intellectual geography of European Orientalism starts to shift a bit. Castell's lexicon heptaglot on this of particular importance here. Petraeus and von Sleben, two German scholars, are both involved in it. But to reiterate, and here I have a picture of Job Ludolf's lexicon, which is printed in London. I think that Amharic and Guz and Coptic as kind of desiderata of Orientalist scholarship here play a particular role, and the prestige and demand for scholars who could study and work with these texts. And then I'll only sort of talk about it briefly, but it comes up in the letters as well. Around 1683, there's a kind of cataclysmic moment in for Ottoman Europe, where an enormous, just there's this enormous dispersal of mosque libraries in the areas conquered from Ottoman Europe after the 1683 siege of Vienna, in particular Buda, but in other places as well. And there is really overnight just this enormous wave of manuscript material that's circulating, often among people who are soldiers, not scholars, but that are slowly aggregated into scholarly libraries. Around the 1690, over the course of the 1690s in particular, and then by the early 18th century, are finding themselves into major institutional libraries, and that then sort of set the stage for a new tradition, or kind of a more advanced German pedagogical tradition in Oriental studies, and particularly in Arabic, Turkish, and Persian. And so in Leipzig, where there are about 400 of these manuscripts, you start seeing really capable and competent scholars being trained there in the 1720s and 30s and 40s. And Picques sort of fits into that. So he's there right at that moment. And as we'll see, he's often, he's sort of hearing about the Orientalists, the German Orientalists, who are changing their way of working in response to this material. And in particular, starting to work extensively on the Quran in particular, but on Islamic texts in general. And I think that this is on a kind of a trajectory to docessi. So I said before that I think, and this is speculation, that Picques sort of more general Oriental studies, I imagine he knew Hebrew before that, started really in the 1680s. And there is a bit of evidence for his early studies. His annotated copy of Erpenius's Arabic grammar presumably would come at an early point in this development. But what's interesting is that these sources that show his early studies also show how they're embedded and related to his study, or at least interest in European vernaculars. So we find, for instance, here on one of the front flyleaves of the Arabic grammar, a number of English words that are listed and it's quite endearing, the sort of the pronunciation for the French speaker. So church is church, my, partly, partley, in order to pick up a little bit of the English. It's also notable he takes from one of the Arabic proverbs that have been edited by Erpenius, of a kind of motto that he puts on the flyleaf of the manuscript, that whoever experiences, and here sort of that does sort of empirical work, increases knowledge, and whoever is credulous, who just believes, increases error. And this is actually quite, it's a very interesting proverb, and it's one that throughout the 17th and 18th century is sort of used in precisely this way as a kind of motto, but I think also a implicit or a sort of implied justification for studying Arabic texts in a serious way. A second group of sources allow us to date a bit more precisely his study of Arabic, or I think they do at least. So this is it's a word list and a dialogue, and it's written first in Greek, and he dates that as 1680, so by a Greek traveler, presumably somebody who I couldn't track down information about. And then 5 years later, the Arabic is added, and it's added probably in the interest, I think, of studying Coptic, because around the same time, Picques is working with Coptic texts. It's kind of a Coptic notebook. And Arabic is key for the study of Coptic because there are things like psalters that you find in both languages. And what's interesting is there's two things that are interesting about it. One is that this dialogue and the word lists are taken from a French grammar of German. So presumably they're evidence of Picques' interest in learning German. It was around this time that Ludolf was in Paris, so maybe it's connected with that. And the second is that the hand that wrote the Arabic can be identified. And it's that of actually a quite famous scholar who was itinerant Arabic teacher, Solomon Negri, about whom we know a great deal from the work of Jean-Paul Gabriel and Paolo Manstetten. And this is actually probably Solomon Negri's first work and his beginning of his life as a teacher in Paris. And we find, and I think there's no clear indication, so we didn't annotate it in this instance. We find a letter that I think is most likely certainly from Negri, and it's most likely was sent to Picques, looking for a job. So he's trying to get a position that had been kind of floated to him to work in, to do a particular kind of work in the library. Though it's a bit unclear, but it's a quite remarkable letter where he sort of shows off the range of his erudition, quoting Arabic poetry, but also quoting Cicero and using Greek and everything they can to show how capable a scholar he is. And so there's also noteworthy since Copenhagen, there's a decent amount of material in Copenhagen that might be Picques related. So it's hard to discern because it kind of got aggregated at some point within a call number. But there are calligraphic exercises and a grammar table that at least in one instance are clearly linked to a Danish scholar who was in Paris and that had a connection to Picques, Frederick Rosgaard. And so at the very least, it suggests that Rosgaard was in the 90s. That Picques is perhaps playing a role of connecting Solomon Negri as an Arabic teacher to young students who are interested in learning Arabic. Another set of sources show his study of Persian, but also I think the extent to which he worked with whoever really was available or coming through Paris, who would allow, who sort of had knowledge of these languages. So his manuscripts give an impression of somebody who uses every resource at his disposal to learn. And this is Francis Richard's statement, but I imagine it's right, by an Armenian from Aleppo. And it's an excerpt from the Timurid Persian translation of the Khalilullah Dimna tales, which is also notable because at the time this was a text that was studied in order to read, studied alongside the Turkish translation of the same work. And this is also true if you look at Picques' copy of Grieve's Persian grammar. He has a number of notes in Turkish there as well. So he's studying these languages together. And I think I've identified in Copenhagen a copy of a Turkish commentary on the Bostan of Sadi. So that's in his hand. but I'm not entirely certain of that. Also notable, you'll see here, so on the left, his name is Joseph Lazare, has copied the text, and it's been transliterated, presumably with his oral input by Picques, and it's been glossed also in Italian, which is quite notable. So he's done an interlinear gloss through the entire in Italian. It sort of gives a sense of how it is that he worked. And then we also have, and this is the thing about which I know the least, but I think is probably the most fascinating of his studies, is we have his work with Mandaic, and there's some of the material in Paris was identified by Francis Richard, but there's a whole cache of Mandaic texts that were copied for him, I think by Huntington, around 1683, and that show him how he studied and read these texts. And this is of particular interest because there's this sort of thinking of the Sabian, and he's connecting it with the Sabian peoples mentioned in the Quran. And he's getting his texts from Huntington, but I think also from Petit de la Croix. And as far as I know, nobody sort of reconstructed this moment in scholarship, and how scholars like Picques, but also somebody like Levinas Varnus, a student of Golius in Istanbul, is also interested in the subject, consulted Islam and used Islamic sources on the subject. And then finally, we have the case of Picques himself kind of acting as an intermediary. And I found a couple instances of this, and it seems like he was at the very least somebody that outsiders felt that they could reach out to in the hopes of accomplishing something or gaining influence, or having their sort of petition or their voice heard. In this instance, it's a bishop in Rome is reaching out to Picques to ask whether or not he can find some way to have to petition the king in order to have the instructions given to his ambassador to arrange for the Christian community in Marden to have permission to restore their church. You need special permission to do this. And what I think we're seeing here on the right is the Picques who's taking a kind of source text that's probably written to him in Arabic, and he's sort of translating it and reshaping it into a kind of petition that would have might have effect. And there's sort of a couple instances or sort of traces of this kind of activity that we see in Picque's correspondence. So I mentioned before that there's this moment, sort of this cataclysmic moment of dispersal of Ottoman European collections that happens in the 1680s. Already in the next following year after the siege and conquest of Ottoman Buda, we have a letter which is from a Fraser, and I think this is the James Fraser, who's the royal librarian, and mentioning that there were English and Scottish gentlemen, so presumably people who had gotten these from either soldiers or people who had gotten them from soldiers, who had brought back some Arabic manuscripts from the ruins of the Library of Buda, which is a very famous example. It's often discussed at the time, often in very grisly detail, and he says that he showed them to capable people who told them they didn't contain anything exceptional. So there were Qurans, a number of volumes of Quran commentaries, some books on moral philosophy, fragments of Turkish and Arabic dictionaries, books on astronomy, very nicely written, but all modern enough. And also very interestingly, I'm grateful to my colleague Paula Manstetten and the sort of glories of the social network, that she tracked down and identified a manuscript from Buda that was sent to Picques in that very year. So in the year that he received this letter from Fraser by Christian Menzel. So I think that this gives a sense that already by that time, probably through Ludolf, though there aren't that many letters that survive from this earlier period, that he had quite a close connection with German scholars. Picques is, however, I think particularly exceptional in the role he played as a mentor to young German scholars who were coming through Paris. And I think there's kind of an interesting question of why the Orientalists aren't going to Leiden around this time. Utrecht is important at this time for Orientalists. This is connected also with Reiland. But I think, and I'm not sure, but this is also a bit speculating from Picque's letters, because he's trying to get access to a manuscript in Leiden, that access was quite limited at that time for whatever reason. But we see the scholars who are coming through Paris, and as a kind of part of the grand tour. So they're sometimes on the way down to Italy. And so quite remarkable letter that I found among the Grodek Nachlass in Berlin that is, I think, a kind of note that Picques left Grodek, perhaps at a library, where he says, we sort of gets a sense of his sort of the voice of a mentor. He says, since I did not have the pleasure of finding you here when I came this morning around 10, you'll allow me to use this note to wish you happy travels, and also to thank you for having presented me with these papers, which are a witness to your commitment to the most difficult and abstruse learning. And you'll see in Italy if there's someone who has a taste for this kind of erudition. And I think this describes quite well what this network is. It's a network of people who have difficult and obscure tastes in scholarship, who are trying to do hard things with language, and probably take a certain pleasure in that. And what's particularly interesting is that he names individuals who he should contact, and two in particular. One is this bishop, Athanasius Sefer, who I haven't found anything on. If anybody knows about him in Rome, I'd be very curious. And the other is another figure I couldn't find anything about, Giovanni Pastrizio from Dalmatia. And it's interesting because we actually have evidence that Grodek then relayed information from Rome about an Armenian Bible. And in a very kind of interesting exchange that I think illustrates very well how it is that the correspondence networks are being employed in the use of scholarship. Picques asks Montfaucon, is traveling to Rome at that time, to have a look at this Bible and to sort of judge. And I think he wants Montfaucon to judge the antiquity of it. Who then Montfaucon then replies to say that he brought Giovanni Zale. So this is talking about Pastrizio, and another young Armenian, 18 years old, who is well versed in the language of this country, and we visited together this Armenian Bible in the Vatican. And then he says, it was covered in gold. It's a very luxurious copy. But it was modern enough. This isn't something of great antiquity or worth for scholarship. So he's basically sending somebody out to kind of judge, do a kind of autopsy of the manuscript to see if it's something of particular interest for the history of the Bible and Bible translation. And the Grodek, so there's about 20 letters going in each direction, and it's exceptional, like the Ludolf one, where we have a relatively intact correspondence between both sides. And the Grodek is also very notable for the appearance of a very particular text. It's something I didn't know a lot about, but he's doing a Hebrew edition of the Tales of Sendivar, and this is a bit like the Kalila Wadimna tales. This comes from Middle Persian. It supposedly has an Indian model, though I don't know if scholarship thinks that it does anymore, and was known through this Hebrew translation. And Grodek, when he was in Paris, had found a manuscript of an edition of this work for the Hebrew with the notes of a very learned Orientalist named Gilles Ménage, who had studied Hebrew, but also studied Turkish, Persian, and Arabic at a very advanced level in the 1630s, 40s, and 50s, and left about 400, maybe 500, a great number of manuscripts, of Oriental manuscripts, that first went to Sweden and then came back and are now in the BNF. And he found basically this kind of unpublished edition that Gilles Ménage had produced, and was producing his own edition based on it. And it's an extraordinary exchange that he's reaching out to Picques, and Picques is sort of looking into things for him, and he does something very particular. He looks into this new bibliography that had just arrived in Paris in manuscript form, or recently arrived in Paris in manuscript form, the Keshvaz Zanun of Katib Çelebi, which is the great 17th century Ottoman bibliography. And it is in no small part really the foundation of Orientalist bibliography. And this is, it's really hard to overstate its importance. The moment when, through translations, one in particular, sort of a compilation from the Keshvaz Zanun, it suddenly becomes possible to identify manuscripts in a way that nobody had dreamt of in the early to mid 17th century. And so Picques is here in the correspondence giving us a rather privileged view of a kind of still very foggy and unclear moment, but extremely important moment in the history of Oriental studies. And that's when the Keshvaz Zanun arrives. Now, the best source I found on this is the colophon in Petit de la Croix, François Petit de la Croix's translation of the work, translates the entire work, copies the whole thing out, at the turn of the century. And he says that there were two copies. So one was well written. It's very interesting. It's well written but poorly transcribed. So it's pretty, right? But he doesn't get there's a lot of errors in it. And of course, because the Keshvaz Zanun is a bibliography, it's an enormous amount of possibility for error with names and titles and place names, things like that. And then the other one, there was another one that was well transcribed but poorly written. It's not a very pretty script. And both of those can be identified, and it's actually quite interesting. And I hope that someday soon somebody really just reconstructs this whole story. The first was acquired by Galland in 1682, and then immediately studied and worked through it as a kind of a source for compiling lists of manuscripts to buy or manuscripts to look out for. And he starts translating lists from it almost immediately. There's one in 1682, does another in 1685, which is the one that we're looking at here. And around 1685, 86, I believe, a second copy comes. And this is the copy that is the one that's well written, that looks very nice, but with a lot of errors. And very interestingly, it seems to have been stolen from the chief military judge's library. So this is Feyzullah Effendi, he's Sheikhul Islam soon after that, by his son, at least according to the account given by the ambassador, the French ambassador, and who paid a considerable sum for it. And this work had been really rumored. And it was quite famous, and they saw it, rightly so, as the key to collecting and studying Islamic texts. And most famously, it's compiled, or a large amount of the information from it is compiled into the Bibliothèque Orientale in 1697. And I've done a certain amount of comparing of the entries of the d'Herbelot's Bibliothèque Orientale, which was edited also by Galland after d'Herbelot's death. And to me, it's just unclear what exactly happened and how exactly it was compiled. Sometimes it follows Katib Çelebi quite closely. Other times there are just things in there that couldn't be, that not only are not in Katib Çelebi, but are that wouldn't be there if somebody had actually properly read Katib Çelebi's entries. So there's a bit of a mystery. But what we see here with the Picques, looking up this things with Sendabar and reconstructing through this bibliography, the kind of relations between this and this text and other translations is, I think, a really remarkable example of the use of this text almost immediately on its arrival in Paris. Now, I would say that the primary, I don't have too much more time, so I'll try to get this quickly. I'd say that the primary value, or what really makes this correspondence, or the correspondence that Picques had, exceptional, is it gives you a particularly privileged view at the practice of Orientalist scholarship in these years after Türkenbeutel arrives in Germany, and when scholars who are working more in this, or were working more in the polyglot biblical scholarship vein, start turning towards Islamic sources. And in particular, there are two major Quran projects that emerge in Germany in the 1680s and 90s. One is Hinckelmann's edition of the Quran, which is completed, though without a translation. And I think for good reason. We have Hinckelmann's manuscripts. It shows you did enormous difficulty reading it. And the second is just this wildly ambitious project of Andreas Akolutis, who's an Orientalist who collected many, many Türkenbeutel manuscripts, including dozens of Türkenbeutel Qurans. Türkenbeutel here referring to the looted material from Ottoman Europe. He tried to do basically a polyglot Quran. And here in the Picques letter, we have a really remarkable detail that I don't think I've encountered anywhere else, where Grodek mentions to Picques that Akolutis has been working on, so he's working on this edition, and that he's actually keeping in his house a Turkish man who is fairly learned according to the customs of his land. So letters like these provide really crucial evidence to understanding the collaborative context of this kind of scholarship. So just a final example, but I think in some ways it's the most extraordinary, and it's in any case the best documented. Through Grodek, a young Orientalist, who's a student of Akolutis named Sigismund Zayfish, is sort of introduced to Picques in 97, I believe. And we actually have the letter that he brought, because it's a letter. So Grodek is replying to Picques' old letter, and then he says, you know, I thought of fitting to reply to you, I'm quoting, via the gentleman who's the bearer of this letter. So Mr. Zayfish, and that's why he's called Zayfish here, native of Dresden, well-versed in Oriental languages and other sciences. And I hope to have done well in introducing him to you, especially as a great friend and student of Akolutis, and Picques had corresponded with Akolutis as well. So please have the courtesy to accommodate him according to your usual good nature, and to bring him to see the illustrious Abbé de L. And I don't know who that is. So if anybody has any idea, be curious. Monsieur Clément, Baluz, and others. And the friendship you show him will be a great favor to me, and I'll try to do the same to you in the future. And this is all sort of standard enough. But what's remarkable here is that Picques actually replied in extreme detail to say everything that he did for this young Zayfish. And what Zayfish's aims weren't clear, but it's at the beginning, but it's evident that Picques really went above and beyond. So he says here, kind of enumerating, say, I hope you understand what I did for you. So he says, I'm representing him with my Oriental manuscripts and my printed books, and I'm borrowing some from my friends for him to use. He had a number from the Colbert collection. He wants for nothing, neither books nor people to consult them, also very interesting. And through my mediation, he has a book in the Chagatai language and Tatar letters in folio, damask paper, written in Samarkand in the year of our Lord, 1436. I'm sure that there is in the world no book rarer or more curious. It can serve as a history of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. As we'll see, this is kind of an odd statement. Mr. Zayfish resolved to copy Abul Feda from 2 of the king's manuscripts, and has corrected his printed Tamerlane with 2 manuscripts, my own and that of Mr. Colbert, which contains Tatar letters. So this is what I think he's doing is he's kind of nudging Zayfish in the direction of working with these particular sources, and in particular working on Chagatai, an Uyghur script, which is what he's describing as Tatar letters, as Uyghur script. And quite remarkably, we have in Dresden, where Zayfish became a kind of Picques-like figure. He becomes the curmudgeonly librarian in Dresden. We have a packet of notes that were probably all taken from, or for the most part, represent the notes that he took in Paris. And so one thing that Picques didn't mention, but it's very prevalent in his notes, is that he's looking at Qurans and Quran translations. So this is probably in no small part a study trip related to his teacher Akolutus's very ambitious effort to make a polyglot Quran. He also did copy Abulfeda's geography, which was a major desideratum of Orientalist scholarship, and that was a sort of generation of scholar was trying to publish it, and is here notable in particular because he employed two manuscripts. I think one, without a doubt, is the manuscript copied by Wilhelm Schickard in Tübingen in the early 17th century. The other one, I think, was copied from what was thought to be an autograph of the work in Leiden, but I'm not entirely sure of that. And I was comparing the text, and it didn't add up 100%, so I don't feel absolutely confident about that. But then I think most interesting are this Chagatai work, and this relates to sort of two things. So there's the Golius edition of Ibn Arab-Shah's Life of Timur, his account of Timur. Ibn Arab-Shah was born in Damascus, and then he goes off to Samarkand, and he's on the Ottoman court for a while. He's translating, and he comes back after really having, sort of seen sort of the Timurid Empire up close, and Timur, and he writes an account in Arabic that then gets studied in the early 17th century as like particularly as it is, of course, a particularly privileged historical view. And it's edited. It's one of the first major Arabic texts to be edited, especially I think it's the first in Northern Europe, by Jakob Golius. And the edition is very famously faulty, and every student who follows has it, and their deepest desire is to fix and improve on this edition. So of course that would make one very famous. Golius didn't provide a translation, probably because it would be very hard to do that. And he, though he says it's so that the students can provide their own, and he didn't provide any notes whatsoever. And I think he did it on the basis of a single manuscript, and so there are a lot of errors in the edition. And what Zayfish did, as a sort of young ambitious scholar working in Paris, is he collated the printed edition with two manuscripts. One was in Colbert's collection, the other one was Picques. And he added, he even adds a little colophon that notes it, that he sort of got these sources from the Sheikh Louis Picques, the colophon in Arabic. But what's particularly notable, and I should add also, these weren't, he never finishes this work. Zayfish, a bit like Picques, never publishes in his lifetime. But these collation notes actually have this whole afterlife throughout the 18th century, and they're studied by a young scholar in Leipzig who visits Picques in Dresden and learns from him, named Johann Jakob Reiske. And Reiske then brings these to Leiden, and then through Reiske's teacher, they end up making it their way into an edition. But what's particularly interesting is this 1436 manuscript. And what Picques doesn't say is it's odd that he says that it would be useful for a history of Tamerlane, because the text is actually Mirajnameh, so it's an account of the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's lavishly illustrated, and in this Uyghur script that nobody could read at the time. And what we see here on the left is in Zayfish's copy of Ibn Arab-Shah's the edition. He's copied a section that is in the manuscripts of that work on Uyghur script, and he's I suspect this is a Picque's suggestion, because there's no way that Zayfish would know that they were there, and then presumably is trying to use that little guide, a kind of rough and ready guide, in order to read this text. And he had, which he copied in his notes, French descriptions of the paintings that were made by Petit Delacroix on the basis of captions here in the Arabic and Turkish. And as far as I know, no real understanding of Uyghur script. So what's going on here? And I just will wrap up with a few observations. So I'd like to suggest first that what I think is happening here is something very familiar to us today, but indeed something that many of us have experienced, but I think in the 17th century was something very new. Zayfish is encountering a research librarian. So he's somebody who has advanced knowledge of specific collections, doesn't necessarily publish extensively, but has knowledge on not just those collections, but on the work that has to be done or should be done within those collections, within the context of the aims and goals of a scholarly community of specialists. And I think here in particular on Christina Haugen's description of the Scaliger, of the sort of the world that's visible through the Scaliger letters, and of Scaliger as a kind of collaborator and organizer of intellectual communities. And I think that's what we see here. I think Picques is an organizer of intellectual communities. As a second point, I think that we're at a kind of threshold between republic of letters, or what one might call that, sort of based on a kind of a particular form of learned sociability and a particular kind of correspondence, to something in the guise of Historia Literaria that's moving towards a modern research institution. Something evident from the correspondence is just the enormous amount of detail, but also things like these annotations, evidence of that detail being compiled. And then finally, and this is something that I've been thinking about in the context of 19th century, in particular cataloging enterprises, and the way in which that changes the character of scholarship, as people can not only work with manuscripts, but they can work with manuscripts in the context of catalogs of 40 other collections, that we see a reorientation in what counts as kind of scholarly advancement or scholarly novelty towards the blank spots in scholarship. And I believe that those blank spots are only evident with the view of somebody like a Picques, with the view permitted by something like the Keshvazanun, with the Ottoman bibliography of Katib Çelebi, and with the view of the kind of collective project of information collection evident in Picques' correspondence. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.